Hello, this is Coach Wilson, and this is Unit 7, Day 7. Today we're going to be talking a little bit more about just Western settlement. We're going to be talking a little bit about Native Americans. Big thing I want to talk about here is I want you to write a paragraph about the West and how did American settlers make it on the frontier. So, we talked a little bit about Native Americans in Day 6. Now we're going to move on to life on the frontier. Okay, continue talking about some of those issues with Native Americans, and we'll kind of keep moving into some of those issues of the West. So, modernization is a very big part of the West during this time. Big businesses are beginning to transform the West. Unfortunately, there is also very rough conditions. We talked about a little bit of that with settlers not being able to move west easily, making a struggle to get there because of the Homestead Act, not having the money, etc. You also had corn huskers, corn binders, automatic grain spreaders, and other inventions that made farming much easier, but many of these people could not afford this machinery. Now, one thing that took place during this time with large businesses is they built bonanza farms. And these were businesses managed by professionals, and they promised enormous profits to the investors. So, essentially, a shareholder could invest in the company and become a shareholder, and then that money would go towards buying equipment, etc., paying farmers, and then as the profits came back, you would double up on your investment, etc. And many of these bonanza farms specialized in cash crops. The big problem was it hurt small farmers. Your small farmers who grew corn and tobacco and all these other crops, grains, whatever, now they're having to compete with these big businesses who are specifically growing one crop. Your small farmers tended to do a lot of subsistence farming where you had to supply everything for the family. You also had farmers with limited equipment because they had invested in because they were limited to the size of the equipment they could buy because of the size of their harvest, especially smaller farmers, and so for them they couldn't get bigger equipment, which meant they couldn't keep up with these big bonanza farms. Now, the other thing that we talked about the other day, the possible futures you could have in the West, was mining. The mining frontier was one of those things that since 1849, when the gold rush struck for the first time, that's kind of been up and down for many years. Gold and silver wasn't the only thing, obviously, to mine for, but many people, that's what they were headed for. And in Pikes Peak, Colorado, around the 1860s, rumors of silver and gold strikes brought thousands out to the west. So once again, we're showing another way that people are migrating westward. Later strikes brought thousands to the Sioux country. And the Sioux Indians have been forced all the way out to Colorado, and you're going to see as we continue to talk about Native Americans in the future that they are continually being pushed off of their land. These mining communities also brought together all types of people. They had drinking problems, gambling, vices, and miners rarely struck it rich. So you had a lot of people looking for an easy way out to just kind of, make it through. Now, the cattle frontier was also another part of ranching, was another part of the West that was very popular. American settlers in Texas had adopted many of the Mexican ranching practices, including dress and equipment. And funny enough, many of the kind of ideas that we have about cowboys and things of that nature come from the way that Mexicans dressed during this time. And the big business really forms around the cattle industry. So we talked a little bit about big business and bonanza farms, but the cattle industry is where big business is really going to get involved, especially with the development of the railroad and all those things into the 1870s, 1880s. They're going to be able to transport large amounts of cattle to market much quicker. But you still had individual cattle drivers, but they struggled quite a bit. They were involved in what we call the long drive, and they would actually move cattle from these distant ranges or distant farms to railroad centers to ship cattle to the market. It's very dangerous work. You're talking about you're riding across miles and miles and miles of frontier land with a herd of cattle, and who knows what you're going to run into and what issues lie. One of the things that actually ended the cattle drive, though, was a lot of times when these cattle drivers would ride across land, they would end up picking up other cows and various things from farmers who didn't have their cows fenced in, and they just had them grazing, or they had a fence up, but it wasn't a very good fence. One of the things that is invented is barbed wire by Joseph Glidden, and it allowed for herds to be able to stay in one place and for a farmer to kind of protect his herds and keep them from getting out. It also stopped the free grazing like I was talking about. The problem that the cattle drive had for the most part, though, is there's very cold winters, very dry summers, and cattle fever. Now, cattle fever is going to lead to them turning to the Texas Longhorn eventually, but we don't need to get into that other than to say that the Texas Longhorn was one of the most important developments in the cattle industry. Now, by the turn of the century, the myths of the West were growing, and Americans believed that the American frontier no longer existed, and this is a very important part to note. Frederick Jackson Turner was an advocate. He wrote about the frontier and its opportunities, and his thesis and his belief was that the frontier produced individualism, restless and socially mobile Americans, persons ready for self-improvement, committed to democracy. The problem was he left out a huge group of people, specifically no consideration of Native Americans. He never really considered the views of African American men, women, immigrants. Basically, he just said that men, women, immigrants, and other races experience the exact same thing on the frontier, and that wasn't the truth. He also played down the involvement of big business, and that big business wasn't the reason the West was getting settled quicker, even though it was actually quite a big portion. African American Chinese miners settled and set up businesses as well. The West could not have been settled without African Americans and Chinese miners and Irish workers and all these other immigrants who helped build the railroads, the mines, etc. The problem is discrimination is still a huge issue with various groups in the West, but the strong legislators in the West and these short terms for officials is going to make it very hard for them to do anything to protect immigrants and Native Americans who still have no rights in the West. Now, one of the final things we're going to talk about is the American cowboy, which began in literature. Edward Wheeler wrote about these cowboys, painted a hero who was an outlaw, a miner, a gang leader, and the cowboy always dealt with evil. You also had William Cody, who was one of the most famous cowboys, named Buffalo Bill as a nickname. And he used this nickname in like Wild West shows, steer roping contests, rodeos, and even staged like fake battles. Okay, and that's all I have for you today. Very short day of notes, but here are your 4 vocab words. Please let me know if you're having any questions. There is no questions for today. Just make sure you get these 4 vocab words down.